Youth Biolab Jeunesse.
Hi, I'm Steve.
I'm Megan.
And I'm Angelica.
We're from the Youth Biolab at the Albertson Research Center at St. Boniface Hospital. We all know the job of the hospital is to treat patients. Here at the Research Center, our job is to study disease. If we ever want to cure a disease, we have to understand it first.
When you think of scientists studying disease, you probably think first of things like cancer or more recently, COVID-19. We don't study either of those here. But there are research scientists over at the National Microbiology Lab who are studying infectious diseases like the flu or COVID-19 or Ebola, where they have special equipment that can protect them from the germs that they're working with. There are also groups of cancer scientists working over at Cancer Care Manitoba in Health Sciences Centre, and it's their job to study cancer. We like to keep scientists together so that they can work as a team to come up with cures or treatments for these diseases that we see.
At the Albertson Research Center, we have three big interests. On our fourth floor, we have the Division of Neurodegenerative Disorders. This is where we study diseases that affect the brain and nervous system, just like Alzheimer's disease and type 2 diabetes nerve damage. On our third floor, we have the Institute of Cardiovascular Sciences. This is where we study diseases that affect the heart and cardiovascular system. On our second floor, we have the Canadian Centre for Agri-Food Research in Health and Medicine, and this is where we study food. They research foods that are really good for us, some that might be bad for us, and some that might be so good that they act like medicine.
Our lab, the Youth Biolab, was created so that we can share some of the things that we do here in the Research Center with you. And hopefully we can help you learn a little bit more about how medical science works and understand a little bit more of the science of your own health. So today what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a dissection of pig hearts and lungs. This is something that we call the plucks, and it's a really good sample because it's, again, a really good model of what is inside our own bodies. So whether you're just in grade 5 starting to learn about all the body systems, or whether you're in grade 11 starting to learn about how systems and organs actually work in a little more detailed anatomy, this is a dissection where we can really learn a lot about what's going on inside our body. We all know what our lungs do. Their job is to help us breathe. We take a big deep breath in, and you're filling your lungs with air. Now in that air is oxygen, with a whole bunch of other things as well. There's nitrogen, there's carbon dioxide, there's all these atmospheric gases. But the one that we really want is that oxygen. So your lungs have to work together with your heart to distribute that oxygen throughout your body. Your lungs are pretty big. They come all the way up to your collarbone and all the way down to the bottom of your rib cage. Okay? We normally say our heart is about the size of our fist. That'll be nestled in between. So our job here is to get a look at what these things really look like to help us understand a little more about what's inside our body. That's really the job of our researchers here at the Research Center. If we can understand more about what's happening inside our body and more about what's really going on inside our body, maybe we can figure out how to treat some of these problems that happen in disease situations that we research. So here's a diagram of the lungs and the respiratory system. Coming from the nose and the mouth, we come in through a big tube called the trachea, which then branches into two big branches called your left and right bronchus, or your bronchi, plural. And those bronchi travel down and branch into smaller and smaller bronchioles, little branches. You can kind of imagine this as an upside down tree. Here's the trunk of the tree that branches and branches and branches and branches. At the very end of these branches are little air sacs called alveoli. They kind of look like little clusters of grapes. And that's where the actual oxygen gas exchange happens, where the oxygen can get into the blood and the carbon dioxide can be released for you to breathe out. In our sample, we'll be able to see most of these things except those alveoli. They're very, very, very small. They're microscopic. You would need a microscope to be able to see these, but most of these other structures we should be able to see. Now on the sample that we have, it's not just the lungs, it's not just the respiratory system itself, it's tied in with some other pieces of the circulatory system and even some parts of the digestive system. So what we'll see in our sample, we should be able to find these things. We should be able to find our trachea. That's this right here. Trachea is almost easiest to find by touch. You'll notice here it looks like it has little rings around it, and it does. Those are rings of cartilage. So even on yourself, you can do this right now. If you take two fingers, raise your chin a bit, you can feel in here those rings around your own trachea. They're hard and tough. They'll hold that trachea open so air can easily move in and out. So the first thing we'll want to identify is our trachea. The lungs should be pretty easy to identify. Like we said, they're pretty large. Okay? 2 lungs. The other thing we should have on this sample is a second tube that you can kind of see starting here, and it runs down this way. This will be part of our sample as well. So if you think about it, right next to your trachea, which obviously carries air, that's your windpipe, we should have another tube going down through here, and that tube will be our esophagus. Okay? And that will carry your food. Okay? So you have your windpipe, and you have your food tube for when you swallow. Trachea, esophagus, and obviously in this sample we will also have some parts of the circulatory system. There should be a heart in here as well, with one more tube that we can try and find, and this is the big tube that comes out of the top of the heart and branches out through the body to carry blood where it needs to go. This tube is called your aorta. Okay? And that's your body's biggest artery. So when we get the sample out in front of us, that's our first job. Let's see if we can identify these 5 things: heart, lungs, trachea, esophagus, and the aorta. Let's get started. So the sample we'll be working with today that contains the heart, the lungs, and those 3 tubes we mentioned come from pigs. Now, we pick these up from maple leaf pork. These are kind of the leftover bits and pieces when they take the meat that people eat from the animals. The hearts, the lungs, things like this are really good for scientists to study because they can really help us learn about what's really going on inside our own body. So they're a very, very good model. These are not preserved specimens, so they're like raw meat, which means I'm going to glove up for this. It could have some germs on it, and we'll make sure that we work in a tray and work over top of a diaper so any spills that happen are going to be contained here. Before we get started doing any dissection or any lab work that involves anything that ever came from a living thing, the big rule here when we do something like this is these need to be treated with respect at all times. So, whether it's a part from a pig, whether it's cells or anything that we keep living outside of the body, the number one rule when we do something like this, with respect at all times, and carefully and gently as we go. These are here to learn from and not to play with. So let's get started. Okay, so here's our sample. And the first time you see this is something that kind of surprises a lot of people, how big these lungs actually are. In this tray, what we're mostly looking at is our 2 lungs, these 2 big structures here and here. Let's see if we can identify what else is going on in this tray. Like we said, we're looking for 5 things: the heart, the lungs, the trachea, or your windpipe, the esophagus, your food tube, and our aorta. So let's look a little bit closer. If we start to move the lungs away, and as I touch these, I notice it's really quite a light structure, but they aren't just hollow, empty balloons. It actually feels like there is something in there. You can see there, the word I like to use is spongy to describe these. As you give them a squeeze, they will bounce back kind of like squeezing a sponge. Well, if we move those out of the way, we should be able to find the heart. Okay? So to get a picture of this and how big these are, there's the pig's heart. We normally say our heart is the size of our fist, so there's my fist next to this. So maybe this would be the size of my heart and lungs. So we've got our heart, we've got our 2 lungs, and in here we should also have those tubes that we're after. So if we look a little closer, we notice here 2 tubes right next to each other. Now, like we said, we can feel the trachea to find those bumpy ridges of cartilage, those rings of cartilage that run around your windpipe. If I feel this, it feels a lot like it felt in my own throat. So that's our trachea, held wide open so air can easily move in and out of those lungs. Right next to it is our esophagus. Esophagus is a softer, floppier tube, and if you look closely, you should probably be able to see that it actually has 2 different layers. There's an outer layer that's pink, and an inner layer that's thinner and whitish. So the outer layer on your esophagus is muscle. Its job is to help create those contractions that'll squeeze food down to your stomach. The inner layer is a mucosal layer, and it'll secrete a sticky, slimy mucus into the esophagus so that food will easily slide down the tube. The other end of that tube should be down here somewhere. Before it reaches the stomach, we should be able to find the other end of that esophagus in here. This one's cut a little short, but there it is at the end that would lead to the stomach. One last tube to look for. Since we found the trachea and esophagus, the aorta comes out of the heart and loops down through the trunk, and we should be able to find that right here. So if we look, there's our third tube. This is a giant artery. It's the body's biggest artery. As it comes out of the heart, travels downward. But if we look really close, sometimes we can find where it branches out to take blood elsewhere in the body into smaller and smaller arteries. So there's one right there, a small artery branching off the aorta that's going to take blood elsewhere in the body. And there'll be a number of those as we go here. I can open that tube up just a little bit with my scissors, and you should be able to see a little bit of that branching of the blood vessels. Okay, so as we open that up, you'll see regular branches of arteries coming off of the aorta. Okay. Nice and smooth and slick inside, so blood easily travels through. Okay. That's a nice healthy aorta. These are nice healthy samples. They come from animals we eat, so they need to be healthy, healthy to be in the food chain. So the next thing we're going to try and do here is we want to have a look inside these lungs. When I feel these, like I said, they aren't just hollow and empty. There's things in them. And as we discussed before, that trachea comes down like the trunk of a tree and branches into those lungs until it reaches the little alveoli at the very end. So if we were to follow this, that's what we'd see, is branching into all these different areas. So before we get into this and look for those things, I'm going to show you something first. It's important to think about what your lungs are actually doing. We know that they fill with air, but to see it in real life will really help us see how that air travels through those lungs. So what I'm going to do for you is I've got a length of tubing here, and what we'll do is I'm going to insert that into the trachea. So remember, the trachea is like the trunk of the tree, and that air, as it moves into the lungs, should branch and branch and branch and branch to reach all different areas. They won't just inflate like you're blowing up a balloon. So I'm going to make a quick seal here. What I'm going to do is put a breath of air into the lungs, and I want you to watch and see how these inflate. This is exactly what's going on inside your chest every single time you breathe. I'm going to hold that, but as we can see, the air branched and branched and branched and branched. Perhaps this one didn't blow up. There might be a little cut or a slice in one of those branches, but as we can see that air branch through those lungs. I'm going to release the air. This is what happens every time you breathe out. Okay. And I could have kept blowing there for quite some time. My lungs will hold about 4 liters of air. If you picture a 2-liter pop bottle, 2 of those is about the amount of air that my lungs will hold, and probably similar to these lungs. So 2 liters of air here, 2 liters of air here. Okay? We've seen the branching. What we want to actually do is get inside and see what those branches look like. So our first job is we're going to remove one of the lungs from the sample. So I'm going to have to cut into some of these membranes so we can release the lung right at the point where the trachea meets the bronchus on that side. So I'm going to turn my tray around to make our first cut, which is just to remove some of these membranes here. And now we can see where the trachea branches into the lung. I've got my fingers around it, and I can feel that hard branch of the bronchus here, and I'm going to make that cut. Okay, and as I make that cut, we should be able to see some of that branching already. So there's the branching of the bronchus. And right next to it, if you look closely, you should be able to see that there's another tube here. Now, this one's kind of purpley. It's heading into the lung as well. Or actually, that one's coming out of the lung. This one's going into the lung. These are blood vessels. So remember, the main job of your lung is to bring the air in, but the key point is we need to take the oxygen out of the lung and move it into the bloodstream. So we'll be able, every time we see branches that carry air, we're also going to see blood vessels running right next to them all the way down those branches until they reach the alveoli. So we have veins and arteries to carry blood in and out of the lung, whether they're coming in carrying carbon dioxide to drop off or picking up oxygen. That's our goal here. Make sure the air exchange can happen down in those alveoli. So what we'll do is we'll clear this out so we just have one lung in a tray on its own, and we can work through that lung, and then we can come back and look at a few of the other structures that we have. Okay, so we've just got our single lung here, and what we're going to do is a dissection where essentially we're going to cut this almost like it's a loaf of bread. We're going to start at the bottom of the lung, a slice, a slice, a slice, a slice, a slice, and we're just going to make these slices about 2 fingers thick. So if you remember, our trachea comes down and branches out like an upside down tree. So if we're starting at the bottom of the lung, the branches we expect to see are probably going to be smaller, those smaller bronchioles. As we move up towards the main branches, the bronchi, we should see those get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So I'll turn my tray to make this a little easier to cut. And what I'll do is just take off some serial sections as we move up. So I'm going to hold the lung up and come across. So here's our first slice. And now we want to try and look for those little tubes. Now, those little bronchioles are quite small. Sometimes they're hard to see. Sometimes they're actually easier to feel because they have that those cartilage rings just like the trachea did. And I can feel some hard little tubes in there. And if I tease things apart, we should be able to see some tiny little tubes. And notice they come in twos. So one of these would be an airway tube, a bronchiole, and then right next to it, a blood vessel. And we see a number of those spread throughout. Let's keep cutting up the lung. Okay, as we move up, those tubes are getting bigger, those airway tubes. Okay, there's a bronchiole, spread throughout the lung, branching that air into the tissue. And when you look at this tissue, really what we're looking at is alveoli packed in here. Remember, the alveoli themselves, those little grape-like sacs at the end, they're microscopic. But they are the thing that actually make up what I'm holding in my hand here. Those branches just make sure to get that air down to the alveoli at the end. I'll make one more cut here where we should see some much bigger bronchioles. Okay. Very obvious now where we've got our bronchiole with blood vessels right next to it. In some cases, I don't know if you can see from where you are, but we can actually see that branching as we look down through that tube. You can see how these tubes branch. Even if we cut down through these tubes, that will become quite obvious. How these tubes branch into smaller and smaller and smaller bronchioles. So there's our bronchiole open. And we can easily see how it branches into different parts of the lung to distribute that air. Also, we can see a thin layer of muscle in here. You do have muscle in your airways, so we can open and contract to restrict airflow. If you're exercising, you want those airways wide open. If maybe you have asthma or an asthma attack, what happens there? Well, that airway will constrict and you'll lose that flow of oxygen and air through your lungs. Okay? Use your puffer and that will relax again. So the thin layer of muscle to control that airflow. Asthma is something that you might be familiar with. Probably kids in your class have asthma. Maybe you do. It's fairly common across the population. When we talk about lungs, the big diseases we need to talk about are things like lung cancer and emphysema, a lot of these smoking-related diseases that can destroy airways, but actually destroy that alveoli structure within the lungs and cause cancer in the lungs as well. Lung cancer is one of the leading causes of death from cancer, and most of those are caused by smoking. You can see this is a nice pink, fresh, healthy lung. This is what your lungs look like. If you choose to smoke, we start to see these lungs blacken. We start to see things build up within the airways, and that can lead down the road to some of those smoking-related diseases, obstructive pulmonary disease or emphysema or lung cancer. Really, if you want to keep your lungs healthy, the number one thing you have to do is not smoke. It's really that simple. We can have a quick look at the heart in this video as well. So I'm going to move back to our original sample, and we'll see how the heart ties into the lung structure here as well. So here we have the rest of our sample back in front of us. Let's have a quick look at how the heart ties into this whole structure as well. Because remember, the whole job of the heart and lungs is to make sure that the oxygen and carbon dioxide are being transferred within the lungs, and then it's the heart's job to be moving that blood through in a constant motion. So your heart functions as a pump, and it really has two sides. It has a right side and it has a left side. The right side will take all of the blood from the body. So if blood has been to your body, that oxygen has been used up. The right side will take that blood and pump it out through a big artery called your pulmonary artery right here, pump that blood to the lungs. In the lungs, the blood will drop off carbon dioxide that it's picked up around the body, and it will soak up some oxygen. It's the left side of the heart's job now to take that oxygenated blood and pump it back out to the body. Then it'll come back to the right side, back to the lungs, back to the left, out to the body, back to the right, and around we go. That's your circulatory system. So what I'll do is I'm going to remove the heart from this sample, and you'll be able to see some of those big arteries and veins. There's basically two main arteries and two main veins. Arteries take blood away from the heart. So this whitish tube that you can kind of see right here that I'm holding, that's your pulmonary artery. It takes blood away from the right side. The aorta, which we looked at before, and which comes out just behind here, takes blood away from the left side. Veins, on the other hand, okay, if arteries bring blood away, veins bring blood into the heart. And those we will find on the back of the heart. They're a purplish kind of structure, so this is a vein here, and there's another vein on the right side. So there's two ways in and two ways out. As I cut through this, we should be able to see those four main blood vessels. Your aorta, your pulmonary artery, your vena cava, and your pulmonary vein. Okay, so I'm going to make a cut through there. We can see now we've opened up the two main arteries. This is our aorta, this is our pulmonary artery. I'm going to continue that cut, and that'll take me through those big veins. And then back now, we can find our veins. There's our pulmonary vein right there. And on this side, we should find our vena cava. So this would be blood coming in from the top of the body into the right side. Right side pumps out through the pulmonary artery going to the lungs. And then we come back into the left side, which pumps out to the body through the aorta. Okay. I'll quickly open up those two sides for you so you get a sense of how your heart works. Really, each side works as a pump, as its own pump, almost like a fist, squeezing and squeezing and squeezing and squeezing. It'll fill and squeeze, fill and squeeze. Before it does that, the blood meets up in these two little ears or two little wings. That's called the left and right atrium of the heart. So let's open our right atrium. That's this little wing right here. Basically just a meeting point for the blood as it returns from the body. So I'll make that cut. And we can open up and have a look inside. Now we're looking down towards that fist of muscle, which we call the ventricle. I'll come down through the ventricle with my scissors. Okay, we've opened up that fist now to look inside. And from there, blood would come out my pulmonary artery. That would head to the lungs. On its way back from the lungs, it will meet up in the left atrium, the meeting spot on the left side. So I'll make that cut. And now we can look down to that fist on the left side. Okay. And we'll follow that. Okay. Now our heart is open. When that clenches and squeezes, it would force the blood up through the aorta to take blood to the body. Out to the body, back into the right side. Out to the lungs, back to the left side, out to the body. That's our circulatory system. The heart and the lungs have to work together perfectly all the time to make sure every cell, every tissue in your body receives the oxygen that it needs. Our scientists here, we have a lot of scientists at the Research Center studying heart, and we know when things go wrong with your heart, things can start going wrong with how your body receives oxygen. Even changes in how the blood flows through the heart is going to change how parts of your body, like your brain, like your muscles, receive that oxygen that you need to live. So when we look at problems of the heart, we always have to remember these things are connected throughout the body to other systems, and they're dependent on those systems too to keep you healthy. When we talk about your health, really, the best thing you can do for your hearts and lungs are these same things you've heard for your entire life. Eat healthy foods, exercise a lot, and make sure you don't smoke. We know that those things can cause some of the diseases that we're interested in here in the Research Center, that lung researchers are interested in, and that can cause a lot of death and a lot of problems for Canadians and people around the world. Hopefully this has given you a better sense of what's going on inside your body and a little bit about what our scientists do to try and understand some of these problems. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Make sure to click like and subscribe for more videos and follow us on Instagram and Twitter. To support the Youth Biolab's ongoing programming and expansion plans, please contact St. Boniface Hospital Foundation at stbhf.ca.